Hi, everyone. This is Sam Silverman, Managing Partner of EB5AN. Thank you for taking time to join us on today's webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about new EB5 visa I-526E adjudication statistics that were just released. And we'll be going through how many rural versus urban adjudications we've seen by country from April 2022, the start of the RIA, through January 2025, just a few months ago. All right. A little bit about EB5AN. We're a leading EB5 investment fund manager. We worked with thousands of families from around the world. We own and operate many regional centers that cover the entire continental United States. One of the things that sets us apart from many of the other EB5 regional centers in the space is a commitment to investment transparency. We provide all of the financial documents and all the offering documents available for the project to investors to review prior to making any investment decisions. We have a very active blog and YouTube channel with over 1,000 videos and hundreds of blog posts about best practices for investor diligence that are available on our website. As I mentioned earlier, I'm Sam Silverman, one of the two managing partners, joined today with Mike Schoenfeld, and I'll let Mike jump in and quickly introduce himself before we continue on.
Hi, everybody, and thanks for spending the time. This is the exact type of webinar that we really enjoy doing. Both Sam and I worked at the Boston Consulting Group many years ago, and putting on that institutional data-driven lens is very nice when we actually have real data from USCIS. So we appreciate AIA for the FOIA of getting this data and look forward to sharing really never before seen data. This is the first time in the post-RIA era where we have all of this information and helping to dissect and see what this actually means for investors that previously invested and are thinking about investing today.
And just quickly to add on that, one of the unique things about today's webinar is that, over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of speculation about, oh, well, how fast is rural versus urban? Is the government really prioritizing rural investors versus urban? What does that look like? And without any real statistics over an extended period of time, it was easy for competitors in the marketplace to position, their project, their structure as the preferred one, because there wasn't any data, that had really been published, that would really indicate, who was right, who was wrong. But now we have that data, and so, this is going to be an interesting analysis, as to what's actually happening. And again, as Mike said, we both worked at the Boston Consulting Group, where evaluating data sets just like this was kind of, day in, day out, normal work. With that, to help us on the immigration side and implications, we have Ahmed Khan with us, and I'll let him jump in and introduce himself as well before we jump into the data.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Mike. And yeah, so you kind of see my experience here on the screen, but my name is Ahmed Khan. I've been with EB5AN now for several years, and I've been in the industry for well over a decade at this point. I've got experience from an immigration perspective as an attorney and also as a regional center executive. And yeah, to kind of echo Mike's thoughts about what's going on in the industry, super excited to get data like this and share it with investors and just help educate everyone kind of where the industry stands and how best to make a decision if you're looking at EB5 today. So yeah, looking forward to talking more about this stuff.
Perfect. Thanks, Ahmed. So as I mentioned earlier, our regional centers cover the entire country, which means we can seek out high quality projects anywhere in the US. We're not limited to focusing our investments in any one particular geographic region or state. We've worked with investors from more than 70 countries all over the world. Many of our articles and projects and materials have been featured in some of the leading publications around the world. And with that, let's jump into the data, specifically rural and urban I-526E approval data. And before we do that, a quick special thank you to AIA and the Galati Law Firm for obtaining this data through multiple Freedom of Information Act requests against USCIS. So Ahmed, do you want to start with a high-level overview here, and then we'll jump into some of the implications.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the FOIA requests that the Galati law firm and AIIA have kind of worked on, what they do is they get information to us a little bit faster than we might get it normally from USCIS. And then there's also some information that we just wouldn't get from USCIS. So what we get a little bit faster is kind of a breakdown of how many applications have already been filed and are now pending. And also, we get a lot of information from these FOIA requests about breakdown in terms of demographic of filings, in terms of which countries foreign nationals are filing petitions in which categories. And both of these data points are really important, I think, one for determining, just how long the line is getting when it comes to potential backlogs, but also just to understand industry trends, understand what we're seeing from an adjudication standpoint, and then helping investors to prioritize where their funds should be going and to what type of project and how that's going to affect their immigration journey. So this graphic kind of breaks down an overall summary of what we've seen through January 2025. We've definitely seen, a big spike since January 2025 with the new administration, a lot of kind of uncertainty. So, these numbers are definitely going to be extrapolated further. But at least until then, we see that rural has caught up in a big way to urban filings. Previously, urban was almost 2-to-1. And over the last, year and a half, we've kind of seen rural applications increase and start to catch up. But I think what's always interesting is to point out that urban is still outnumbering total number of applications to rural. We've also seen that trend across demographics. And I think we expect the kind of numbers in China that's now outpaced urban in terms of filings, so rural filings from China. And then also for India, we're finally seeing that outpacing happening. What's always interesting to me is the rest of the world, right? I think there was this narrative early on that, high unemployment area projects are just safer, and everyone everyone from the rest of the world is just going to choose high unemployment projects. Well, I think, and some of this data is going to show, there's a clear advantage to some people to filing in rural projects, regardless of where they're from. And the rest of the world has kind of caught on to that, and we're seeing a big increase in the number of applications that are filed in the rural category from the rest of the world as well.
Absolutely. And this is a refresher slide. We did a whole webinar on this data, which was released a couple weeks ago. So just, as Ahmed mentioned, high level, rural still hasn't quite caught up to urban, but it's getting closer. So about 4,300 total at the end of January versus 5,100 total at the end of January of actual I-526Es filed.
Exactly. It's very important to distinguish between a receipt or a filing and an adjudication, right? So filing, receipt, means you filed your application, the government has received it. But on the next slide, when we dig into the new adjudication data, that's going to be reflective of applications that have actually been processed, where the government has reviewed the application and either approved or denied it. So it's just really important to keep that distinction in mind as we go through the data. All right, Mike, do you want to walk us through this approval rate summary?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is probably one of the most surprising pieces that came out that we wouldn't know necessarily ourselves from the data that we're seeing internally is, on average, the I-526Es are being approved at much higher than historical averages, 95+% or 97% technically. Now, it's probably when it all settles going to be a little bit less than that, because this isn't going to capture some of those RFEs or NOIDs that were issued that haven't been fully adjudicated yet. So this is probably a little biased and favorable to approvals, but this is just staggering in terms of the approval rate. Very, very high for all countries, way above 95%. So that's all great news. And then just in the aggregate, when you look at this, the total number of approvals or denials, just adjudications in each category, you can see that rural has about 3 times as many applications adjudicated as urban. And that's even in the case that there have been less applications altogether in that rural category. So it's what we've seen internally. And as we go further into the data, it's going to become even more clear. Just USCIS truly is prioritizing these rural applications. And of these urban approvals, almost all of those are from files that were at the very start of the RIA in 2022. So we'll see that in more detail. But the main thing is just very high approval rates overall and multiple times more approvals in rural projects as urban projects.
Exactly. And so when we look here, we can see, okay, of the 5,191 investors who filed applications in urban projects, of those, only 361, or about only 7%, have been approved since April 2022. Compared with rural, less applications, 4,329, but of those, over 1,100 have actually been adjudicated, or about 27%. So a huge difference there in total, right? And again, as Mike just mentioned, this is an aggregate statistic. This is from April of 2022 through January 2025. But on the right, and this is probably the most important slide in the whole presentation today, on the right, if we isolate just since February 1, 2023, so during the time when both urban and rural projects, were both in the market, competing for investors, and just over the last 2 years, essentially, February 1, 2023 through January 2025, so basically right about 2 years, we can see that urban applications during that period were over 4,500, but of those, only 74, only about 1.5%, were actually processed by the government, whereas rural didn't have as many, about 4,100 or so, but 1,000, or roughly 24%, were actually adjudicated during that period. So 13 times the number of applications were adjudicated for rural versus urban over the last couple of years. And we expect that trend to continue, if not get even larger, going into the future as we continue to see more rural projects enter the market. And Ahmed, do you want to jump in and kind of share what you've seen with respect to those numbers?
Absolutely. And I think you guys have kind of said all there is to say about the numbers themselves. And I think the numbers kind of speak for themselves in terms of what we're seeing as an industry trend, especially for adjudications, right? But what I think what this really points to is, it took a while for us to get here, and really have enough data to kind of back up some of the things that we said 2 years ago. But what I've seen across the industry over the last couple of years is a lot of misinformation with projections that just weren't based in any kind of fact or any kind of reason. And these adjudications now just kind of validate some of the things that we've said in previous webinars, right? If your priority is to get a conditional green card, rural is a very clear path to doing that, and USCIS is treating it accordingly. Let's look back at some things that meant very well, but were just incomplete data sets. So for example, the IIUSA report that came out in the last year that basically detailed approvals and adjudications based on regional centers providing their data. Although that was great information, one of the things that was kind of mentioned in there was a 16-month processing time for urban applications that were approved. But we see now just the sheer volume of data that was missing from that statistic, right? A vast majority of urban applications are still pending. And they could be 22 months, they could be 24 months, they could be much, much longer than the 16 months that was kind of shared in that report. And that's not a knock on IIUSA's ability to report. It's more just that we didn't have as much data as we do now. And now it's pretty clear what's missing from that data set. I think the other thing that's kind of important to note is, there's at EB5AN, we have a portfolio of projects, and we always listen to the investors and then say, okay, out of the projects that we've got available, this one or maybe these two are the ones that align to your goals, right? We try to stay impartial when making recommendations. Different projects are going to suit different investors. And it's been clear over the last 2 years that not every regional center that's selling, to investors feels the same way. Some regional centers only have urban projects available because those are easier to find, let's face it. And they have kind of driven this narrative that, yeah, like urban will be fine. It's only going to be a few months longer. You'll still be okay. And what we're seeing here is pretty much the opposite of that, right? Urban applications largely are being kind of pushed to the wayside while rural applications are being given the highest priority by USCIS. So again, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. Obviously, everything kind of regresses to the norm at some point. For priority processing, it was kind of it was perceived as a small benefit. It's clear that priority processing is a gigantic benefit in the new age of EB5.
Yep, and just two quick things on this because the numbers speak for themselves. One is these are aggregate numbers again, even since February 1st, 2023. And when you look at the charts from prior presentations, rural has continued to grow in popularity and high unemployment has gone down. So it's even more skewed than this in terms of just timeline wise of what's being adjudicated. So that impact is actually even more dramatic than these numbers show when you look at it like on a month by month basis. And then second is there's a saying everyone uses, look at the receipts. So if you look, we've had many webinars, we've made our predictions, we put it out there, very contrary to some of the others. And even when the data was out there, our analysis, like based on that IIUSA one, we very clearly said, sure, the average of the approved might be 16 months, but what percent are actually approved? And are any new ones getting approved? And we very clearly documented that because we have many applications internally, and we were looking at the data and we said, this just doesn't match what we're seeing, like on the holistic level. So I think it's important to actually see what recommendations people are making, what their predictions are, and how credible they are, and how their thought process looks for those things.
Yep. And just quickly, I'll add just a small thing that came to mind based on the statistic about just how many of these applications are being approved and how few are being denied. One thing that's also become clear is that a lot of the things that the RIA was supposed to fix about EB5, we're starting to see some of them actually take real effect, right? I think the 956F, which allows projects to kind of go in and get pre-approval and then market to investors and have the investors know, like, okay, I'm really not taking a big risk on the immigration side of things. With the project side, has really alleviated a lot of the concern and kind of lack of confidence that investors have when going through the EB5 process. So that high approval rate, I think, is a product of the industry having more data like this, giving investors that data, having a more clear defined path of what you need to be approved, and then regional centers like ourselves taking on the onus and the responsibility of going out, getting those approvals, showing them to investors, helping them understand the methodology behind those approvals, and then ultimately leading to a better end result. So yeah, amongst all of this, data about approvals and how quickly they're coming and things like that, it's also important to note that EB5 is working. It really is a real solution for a lot of people who are looking for a path to a green card, whether they're inside the US or out.
Thanks, Ahmed. All right, Mike, do you want to walk us through some of this recent trend analysis that you covered a little bit on the previous slide, but double click on it?
Yeah, and this is in the AIA analysis, one of the most helpful things that was put together because it really shows the impact of what percentage of applications are approved from a certain time period. So you can see what we've discussed before, that right when the RA passed in 2022, towards the end of the year, nearly everything was high unemployment. There weren't many rural deals off the shelf ready to go. There were a couple, but 10-to-1 high unemployment. And then starting in 2023, there was enough time to actually reconfigure projects, find good deals, and get into market. And what you see on the left is the high unemployment approvals, where the darker green is the more percentage approved. And when you look at it, it's just there aren't any approvals coming after 2023. Very, very low single-digit percent for any country other than India. And all of those that pop up where you do see a significant percent of approvals, I'd be willing to bet nearly all of those have come from mandamus filings, and none of those were organic, or very few were organic approvals. So that's just kind of a hint of something that might be a recommendation, and we can talk about a little bit more. Versus on the right-hand side in the rural, you'll see that everything up through February of 2024, like it's looking at 50% plus. I guess in February it's not, but January and before, over half of these applications have already been approved. So if you applied in 2023 and before, you're more likely than not already gotten through the process, which is just drastically different. And we think with the volume of rural applications that have been filed over the last 12 to 18 months, if those are truly getting prioritized, which based on all the data, it looks very clear that they are, it is going to become even more extreme of rural approvals versus high unemployment, and that delta is going to continue to grow. And this heat map does a good job of showing that they are truly prioritizing the rural applications and getting through a vast majority of them in a short period of time.
Yeah, I think heat map is a good way to kind of phrase it, right? We're kind of seeing. The other thing I'll say is it's kind of going back to my point that suddenly, the IRA has fixed a few of the headaches that we used to have in the EB-5 program. It's actually kind of going chronologically, right? And I know we've seen this internally where, okay, you get a project that has one 526E approval, and suddenly a lot of the investors in there start getting their approval as well. But it is done chronologically, right? Earlier investors get their approvals first, later investors get their approvals later. And so I know we're going to talk about it on one of the next few slides in terms of the approval timelines that we've seen, but it really has kind of done exactly what it's supposed to when it comes to rural applications. We see a lot of people be approved in that 9 to 12 month timeline, and there's always going to be outliers. That's why that word exists. But the frequency of those outliers, especially in rural, it seems to be getting smaller and smaller. Whereas urban, definitely, we're seeing a little bit more of that. And we'll talk a little bit about what there are in terms of options to fix that, because yeah, something's got to give on that front. But yeah, it's just clear at this point that USCIS is very clearly prioritizing rural, and they're also looking at priority dates. They're looking at projects that you've invested into, and it's a crescendo effect that kind of follows thereafter.
Perfect. Thanks, Ahmed. All right, so now we're gonna shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the statistics that were recently released from USCIS and compare those and kind of integrate them with internal EB-5AN data, right? Investor investment decisions should never be made in a vacuum. Obviously investors are going to consider more than one regional center, or should consider more than one regional center before making an investment decision. And so, because of that, we think it's really important to just understand, okay, as an investor, if I'm considering making an investment in a rural project, you probably want to know, well, how many investors have been approved in rural projects, and the company that I'm considering investing with, how many approvals in rural projects has that company had? Because that's exactly where I'm going to, hopefully be in the future with an approved rural I-526E application. And so this data, would not be available publicly unless we chose to produce it here and kind of give a very transparent window into how our own internal approvals match up with the data that was recently published from USCIS about rural approvals. Mike, do you want to jump in and share some of your thoughts on this too?
Sure. And I think this is helpful as investors are looking around, and we've done a few different cuts in terms of what percentage of overall rural applications we are versus the amount of approvals that we have. And overall, we're over 20% or right around 20% of the approvals, and we'll get into a little bit the next couple of months of data in the overall rural category. So of all the approvals that have come, we're over 20% of them at this point. And it's really interesting because I don't believe we've had more than 20% of the total applications in rural. So just overall, it feels to us like, because our projects, we typically have them 956F approved, they're very clean and well structured. We're getting approvals based on our data slightly faster than the overall average in the industry, which gives us a higher percentage of the approvals rather than just applications.
Yeah, I think I'd echo that and say that there's a lot of factors that go into an approval, and sometimes we don't want it to get lost in the mix that, oh, just because you're filing a rural application, you're going to be approved in record time, right? That's just not how it is. There's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes that makes sure that investors have a smooth process. Everything from getting that 956F approved, but also once you've got that 956F approval, making sure that the project is continuing to kind of move forward as expected, creating jobs, et cetera, so that investors have a lot of confidence, not just at the outset, but continuing on afterwards as well. And I think these numbers are just indicative of kind of when you do things the way that they're prescribed by the new laws and you kind of work within the system and use some of its advantages, you can achieve a really, really great result.
Thanks, Ahmed. One other quick thing to point out here is that, as of today, there's well over 500 USCIS approved regional centers out there. And out of that, large competitive field, EB5AN individually, you can see here in the last 2 years of approvals, we're about 20% individually. So that means the other 500 plus regional centers in terms of prior rural approvals, collectively 500 competitors represent about 80% of the prior 526E approvals in the last couple of years. So that's just kind of important to consider as you are looking, for a rural project specifically. Obviously, you want to seek out a regional center that has a strong track record of, getting lots of rural project approvals historically. All right, and now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk kind of in a projection approach here. So as Mike mentioned, we've done a number of projections historically, based on recent data that we were seeing. And when we take the current data that we have available through January, so about 1,126 approvals, we can see, all right, EB5AN, we're about 208 or so, other regional centers about 918. But then we say, okay, well, approvals as of May 16th, well, we know how many approvals we have because we're tracking that data, very carefully, but we don't know exactly how many other approvals other regional centers have, but we can estimate, right, just based on relative percentages. And we can say, okay, well, if EB5AN historically in the most recent 2 years was about 20% of total filings, well then, and we were at 360 through May 16th, well then, we can estimate how many total, approvals there are. And so, that's just kind of common sense projection, taking data that's only available to EB5AN because it's our own internal investor filing data, and then extrapolating that, using an established ratio over the last 2 years into how many total filings. And Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, one thing that we had heard some rumblings in the industry was that there's not many approvals coming out recently since Trump took office, and it's actually the opposite. As of January, at the end of January, we only 208 approvals, and in the last couple of months, February, March, April, and the first half of May, we're up to 360, which is a huge increase from the 208 that we were at. So it's actually, the approvals are flowing very quickly right now and these are for our rural deals. So yeah, I guess some of the chatter just anecdotally to us is just false, because what we're seeing is an increase in the velocity of approvals in our rural deals.
That's right. That's right. I think when I talk to investors every day, they're just hearing so many things out there at this point. And I just, we've said it on multiple webinars, and I'm just going to say it again. There's so much data that you don't have to ask us for it. You can actually just find it on completely, kind of impartial sources on the internet at this point. I know Lucid Text, which is a great blog run by Suzanne, is a great resource for investors that uses data to kind of show what's happening in the industry. Obviously, AIIA has published a lot of this data that we're sharing today. There's so much information out there, and the numbers really do speak for themselves. And we're continuing to kind of publish what we've got internally. We're comparing it to what's going on in the industry, and we're just hoping that this helps educate investors so that they can make a decision that's going to help them and their families achieve what their goals are.
And just kind of elaborating on that point of us seeing faster approvals recently, this is an updated scatter plot which shows approvals in all of our rural projects that were issued, all the way through October. And we can see that the more recently filed applications, trending toward the second, and third quarter of 2024, we can see that the speed has, kind of sped up a bit in the last couple of months. Still well under the 12 months, but the trend line, as you can see there on the far right, is definitely toward, faster approvals, often, in the kind of 8 to 10 month approval time for more recently filed investor, rural I-526Es. And Ahmed, why is that so important for new investors filing now?
Sorry, could you why is getting an approval faster more important?
Exactly. Why is
Yep.
that more important now than ever for new investors, considering rural or urban?
Yeah, so as more and more people have applied over the last couple of years, as more and more people have entered into the queue, as we'd like to call it, we're getting closer and closer to a backlog. And the Department of State has warned against this. We don't know when it's going to come, and it's certainly possible that it's not going to happen in this fiscal year or maybe even early in the next fiscal year. But you don't even have a chance at getting your conditional green card if you don't get your 526E approved in a timely manner. And I think that's really what is so illustrative about the data that we're sharing today is, all right, if you're dealing with, a backlog, or sorry, if you're dealing with a situation where a backlog would really affect you and your plans, if you're dealing with, if you're coming from overseas and you want to get to the US as quickly as possible, if you're from a traditionally backlogged country, that approval timeline becomes a ticking clock, basically. And you want to be able to get that approval, get in the queue for the 485, and basically get that green card in hand before a backlog appears on the visa bulletin. And I get this question a lot, so I'm just going to kind of lay out some immigration law 101 here. I think a lot of investors think that a 526E approval is the same thing as getting your conditional green card in hand. And that's not true, right? The 526E is essentially the equivalent of an I-140 for the EB5 category, okay? And so what the 526E does is it gives you the benefit of being eligible for a green card, but you still have to go through either consular processing or an adjustment of status to get that green card. And if you're from a country that has a final action date on the visa bulletin, your 526E could be approved. But if the final action date is earlier than the date that you filed, that green card will not be issued to you at that time. Okay. So just getting the 526E approval, it's definitely a big step one. But being current when that 526E approval happens is a big factor in being able to get your green card as quickly as possible without sitting in another backlog, which a lot of people are trying to escape in the first place by doing this application. So that's definitely the biggest thing. And then the other thing that we'll note about a backlog is also the immediacy of being able to file an adjustment of status. We've done a couple of webinars on that. You can definitely go back and watch that. But that's the other big thing that happens when you get a backlog on the visa bulletin is you're not able to file an adjustment of status at the same time, lock in your kind of status in the US, get an EAD and an advanced parole, lock in the kid's age. There's a bunch of different ramifications of that. So to Sam's point, getting into a rural project, getting an approval as quickly as possible, and beating out a potential backlog could be almost like a cheat code at this point in EB5.
Thanks, Ahmed. Let's shift gears for a second and just talk about all of the requirements for a completely successful EB5 investment journey. So Ahmed, how does job creation factor into the success of an investor's application, and why is it so critical, to be in a project where jobs are either already created or they're in the process of being created currently, and it's very likely that by the time jobs are needed, that all those required jobs will have been created with the required documentation.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked about the 526E and kind of, how that's the first step. Once you get that approved, then you get your conditional green card. There's still one step left, and that's filing the 829 after you've held your conditional green card for about 21 months. There's three main things that the Immigration Service is looking for at the I-829 stage. The first is pretty straightforward. Don't commit any crimes and become removable, right? That's an easy one to check off. Just avoid getting arrested. Second, they're looking to make sure that you've put your money in for the requisite amount of time. All the big regional centers are really aware of this and then are always on top of this to make sure that your immigration attorney is also on top of this, making sure that your money is remaining invested for a required amount of time. And it does vary depending on project, depending on investor, and depending on the rules, which we've talked about in other webinars. But the third and probably the most important thing, the hardest thing to achieve is job creation. Whichever project you're investing into has to create at least 10 jobs per investor to create, to basically get those, to remove the conditions on their green card. And so what we've got here is kind of a showcase of how many people have already been approved. For the most part, these are going to be the first come, first serve type of, they're going to be the first ones to need those jobs, and they're going to be the first ones who those jobs are allocated to. And a lot of our projects have already achieved that job creation for those investors so that when they get to the I-829 stage, now that they're approved for a green card, they don't have to stress out and wonder if their jobs will be created in the future. How can you make sure this is happening? Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, now I was going to say this is my favorite slide that we have in here, and I think it's a testament to how we structure our deals. We like finding deals that are already under construction, don't need to wait for building permits, entitlements, things like that to start. We come in after those boxes have already been checked, and it allows us to get to this, which is all of the jobs for every one of these approved investors have already been created, which means that immigration risk, they have their 526E approval, so their source of funds is clear. The project was obviously approved, and the jobs have been created in the same methodology as was anticipated by the project and in the form. So you've met all of the requirements now where these investors, even though they may have just received their 526E approval a day ago, a week ago, a month ago, they now can look at this and know, I'm safe. My 829 is going to be approved because we've already created those jobs and there's no risk of the project never happening as anticipated, stalling out, or anything like that. So this is the type of slide that makes me happy, knowing that all of these investors are going to find their way through the 829 approval process as long as they don't do anything personally to make themselves ineligible.
That's right. That's right. So that's exactly what I was going to say, that essentially when you're embarking on your EB5 journey, one of the ways to mitigate a lot of the risks on the tail end of the process and the removal of conditions is to go into a project that already has job creation underway and is likely to meet the job creation requirement, whether it's because of construction progress. You can understand if how the project financing works. Do they have enough financing to be completed even if all the EB5 is not raised? You can look at permitting and entitlement issues, making sure that the project is not only just shovel ready, but also continuing to move forward, utilizing the capital. And then, if you can find a project that you're kind of coming into with jobs already created and a lot of that momentum already built, you're putting yourself in a really good position to not have to worry. It's hard enough to worry to get that initial green card. To have to worry again at the 829 phase it's overly cumbersome.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Ahmed. All right, Mike, do you want to take us through some of the key conclusions from this new data that we've tried to synthesize?
Yeah, absolutely. So, just first is, the data really is shocking. When we saw this, I was blown away, and just that the urban high unemployment applications are not getting adjudicated. So we've covered this several times already in the webinar, but anything from February 2023 forward, you're not getting approved. 74 total approvals, and as I mentioned, a vast majority of those likely came from a mandamus filing and were not natural adjudications. And I'll let Ahmed talk about that being a potential strategy for those investors that have already applied in the high unemployment category and are waiting, that maybe it's even more important now than ever before to consider going down that path. So next is just the percentage of rural applications that have been approved. So this is the key summary data. 69% of all filings before January 31st, 2024, so about over a year ago, have been approved. So that means that 70% are getting approved in about that time frame. So you can have confidence that a year is a realistic average from what we're seeing, from what our data shows. And it's not just cherry picking. That's generally what you can see from the data, is that's pretty safe to assume that that's the time frame that you're looking at. Versus in the high unemployment category, I can't even make a projection of how long it will take for any of those applications, or any, especially any new applications, to get adjudicated without a mandamus. Just because, since not much has happened since filings from 2023, I can't tell you if it's going to be 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, or even what the averages will be once they finally adjudicate those applications from 2023 and 2024. So that's probably one of the other big kind of differences, is we do have credible information to predict rural, but we have no data to predict how long it's going to take high unemployment, since not much has been approved since 2023. And then the last piece of this that all fits into some of the other webinars that we've done is just the backlog analysis. So with rural, based on the January data, there's about 1,100 that have been approved. We know that there's over 4,000 visas available. So even if they start approving more applications quickly, which we really hope they do, so that we don't waste that many of the rural set-aside visas, we're nowhere close to where that could generate a backlog. Even if they had 2,000 applications approved, it still likely wouldn't be enough to eat all those visas, and some of those have already been issued, and many of them are not going to happen by the end of this fiscal year. So just overall, to us, what it looks like is that unless they somehow find a way to approve all the rest of these rural ones very quickly, we actually probably have a pretty good runway here before a backlog is going to show up in the visa bulletin. But even more surprisingly, I actually think that it's unlikely we're going to see a high unemployment backlog in the visa bulletin. If they're not adjudicating them, how are you going to get enough approvals for a backlog? So it all depends on what they use to create that cutoff date, whether they only go by approvals, or if somebody in the department wises up and looks and sees a stack of thousands and thousands and thousands of high unemployment applications, knowing that obviously there is a backlog and they issue it. But just based on approvals alone, it's hard to believe that either category will see a cutoff date by the end of the year. And definitely not high unemployment. So it is a little bit different than what we were thinking before, just seeing the actual approval numbers and where we're at. Just generally, I don't think we're even close to where we're going to get that cutoff, although it doesn't hurt to file to be safe. Make sure you get that EAD and adjustment, but it looks like we're still in the clear, at least for the near term.
So Ahmed, how would you advise potential clients, with this new data coming out, considering an urban or rural investment, now knowing that, there's very few urban approvals, very few visas actually, have been utilized for urban. How would you kind of think about that for an investor, debating between urban and rural, given their location and family situation?
Right. So I think that there's two things that I would tell an investor. And so let's break it down to investors who are already in, because I think this is probably kind of alarming to an investor who's already invested in an urban application, in a high unemployment urban application. And we have those investors, right? I think now is a time to consider, just how much you need that conditional green card in your hand. If you have a strong source of funds and you talk to your immigration attorney, and a writ of mandamus filing is something that they see as a real way for you to, propel yourself a little bit further forward and get that approval, that's something to definitely consider at this point. And that kind of brings us, I think, to the second point, which is, okay, someone who's looking at this today and seeing, these red words and saying, oh man, like, there's not going to be a backlog for a long time. I'm good to file in either category and I'll get my green card either way. I'm a little bit more pessimistic. And I think that what this really is creating a much bigger runway to get the application in while the bulletin is still current. So if you're considering a high unemployment area project, this is giving you a great runway to get your application in while it's still current. But at some point, something's got to give. And I think just like Mike kind of, hinted at with an officer at USCIS seeing a stack of, thousands and thousands of cases and realizing, oh crap, there's a real backlog here, and we just let people file willy-nilly. That's kind of what's going on right now. And so it's kind of a catch-22 in my eyes. If you file into high unemployment and you don't plan on filing a writ of mandamus, you're probably going to end up in a situation where either it's going to take a very long time to get that approval, or enough people are going to start being approved that there will be a backlog. It's hard to imagine, although, with bureaucracy and government kind of, inefficiencies, it's certainly possible that both continue to happen, that we don't see a lot of approvals and the cutoff date kind of just stays in the future. But I would stay a little bit pessimistic for my long-term kind of timeline if I was an Indian or a Chinese foreign national applying in the urban category, just knowing how many people are already in the queue. And then for rural, it's similar, but it's just not that bad, right? Because there's more visas available. I think still my long-term outlook looks a lot better in terms of timing. And if anything, now I've got a new short-term outlook, right? Because the visa bulletin might stay current for even longer than we had initially expected. Now we're suddenly into, like, I think I've probably talked to many investors 6 months ago and said, I don't know, you're probably going to be approved sometime in like mid 2025, and you're probably not going to be current then. Well, good for them. I was wrong, and they might be current, and they might get their green cards even sooner than expected. So as always, kind of expect the worst, hope for the best. I do agree with Mike that we're looking at maybe a much longer runway than we had previously expected, but I would still be wary of, something's got to give at some point, and I think I would be wary of filing into HUA expecting that, being an Indian or a Chinese national and expecting, oh, I'll just get my green card in 2 years, no problems, nothing's going to happen.
All right, great. Thank you, Ahmed. All right, we'll shift gears now and just chat for a moment. Mike, do you want to talk to us about some of the different currently available rural and urban projects that we have open today, and kind of how that one size fits all approach, isn't something that we really endorse?
Exactly. And that's kind of the point of how we've thought about deals and having a large portfolio of projects rather than one project at a time. Is the RIA has made it so there's lots of different priorities that can be met: rural versus urban, short repayment versus a little bit longer in an ongoing deal. So in the rural category, we have 3 deals currently. Rocky River is phase 2 of a prior deal that the prior phase was 956F approved. It's another active adult community by Coulter, very similar to our Twin Lakes project that we did previously, and is another under construction deal with a very large developer. Tamarack is our resort project right now. So we've found many resorts in the Mountain West. Golf courses, ski resorts tend to be in rural areas, and you can find ones that are well under construction, well capitalized, and already successful. And Tamarack is our current one that checks all of those boxes, where it's already created all the EB5 jobs that are needed, and continues to construct more properties on site. And that 956F is already approved. So this is one of our most popular deals right now because it checks all those boxes. It's rural, it's pre-approved, all the jobs are created, and it's a large development with great collateral. So that one is moving well. And then our last deal is a little bit different in that it's a preferred equity investment instead of a loan investment. So you're going up in the capital stack a little bit. You're still ahead of the equity, but going to be below the debt. And this is one where it's a neighborhood in the earlier stages, but it is progressing well. And it's a 4% annual preferred return investment, which is a little different than the typical loan model. And the 956F is pending for that. And all 3 of those deals are rural, and we'll get that priority processing. The urban high unemployment deals that we have our vertical project, which is the One Tampa condominium deal, where they've already pre-sold about half of the units. They're still working on the foundation, going vertical very soon. And it is I-956F approved and has one of the shortest repayment periods, since we do have a restriction where EB5 has to be repaid before any profits can come out of the deal to the developer. So that one will be a relatively short loan investment within the EB5 context. And then we have 2 different phases of our next multifamily deal, very similar to the last one that we did. Very easy to build, multifamily, 276 units. And we have both an equity and a debt option for that in the high unemployment area. And this is also pre-approved, and construction really ramps up on that next month. So as you can see, this checkerboard of options, every investor has different priorities, whether it's speed of getting the green card, already having the 956F approved, already having jobs created, getting the money back as quickly as possible. All of those are different priorities. And when you mix and match, we like to have different offerings that can meet different investor requirements. And now that we're seeing this data, investors can really come in with open eyes of understanding what's happening in the market with approval timelines and processing timelines and really make an informed decision.
Thanks, Mike. Ahmed, do you want to jump in and add anything to that?
I think Mike did a great job of kind of summarizing each of these deals and what makes each of them different. And I think I'm just going to go back to one of the earliest things I said in today's webinar, which is there's a different flavor for every investor when it comes to EB5. I think so often you're kind of, sold just one project and said, this is the best deal on the market. This is what we've got, and that project sells out and you think you kind of miss an opportunity. Then before you know it, the next best project that has the exact same pitch kind of appears, right? So the reality is that, there's multiple projects at any given point that are going to satisfy a lot of the EB5 requirements. What differentiates is kind of timing of capital, return, comfort level in terms of location, and then also a lot of the things that we talked about today, including like job creation and things like that. So super important to review all the different options. Very important to ask any regional center representative that you're speaking with what differentiates each deal and having them explain the back end of these deals to you, and doing your own due diligence as an investor and kind of understanding, okay, I've been fed a lot of things. I'm new to this EB5 process. What should I be looking for? And kind of comparing and contrasting different deals across the market, understanding what makes them different, and then really creating a checklist of what your requirements are, and then also some things that you may want, and choosing a project based on that. And I think we've got a really, really good portfolio that aligns with a lot of different investors. We've been a pretty top choice for a lot of investors over the last few years, and a lot of our investors are now getting their green cards and are showering us with a lot of appreciation as a result. So if you're interested in any of these deals, reach out to our team. We're always available to answer any questions. And yeah, me, Mike, and Sam are always available to talk to investors and kind of guide them through this process.
Thanks, Ahmed. We did mention earlier the videos and articles that we have available on our website as a resource for investors as they explore a potential EB5 investment. I just want to quickly highlight two of the most popular investment diligence posts and videos that we have on our site are these two. So key factors to avoid losing money in an investment, talking about the major things for an investor to consider as they evaluate a potential project. And then on the right side, Bill of Rights, 10 kind of critical rights that we think investors should have in terms of getting the right disclosures, what's really happening in the project, and having the opportunity to review key financial information, documents, before making an investment decision. All right, that concludes the webinar content for today. As Ahmed mentioned, if you are interested in any of the projects that we have available or have general questions about the EB5 process, or would like to be introduced to a few experienced EB5 immigration attorneys to discuss whether or not your family may qualify for an EB5 investment, please reach out to us. You can schedule a call using this QR code or send a WhatsApp message, or just book a call on our website, and we'll be happy to chat with you and get you links and information about the projects or about potential immigration attorneys who can help with the source of funds process. So thank you again for taking the time today, and we look forward to hearing from you.